called marine cloud brightening. And this is basically to loft sea salt particles, just sea salt, right? Particles from ocean platforms or vessels, probably several hundred, maybe a few thousand around the world. And you basically just loft them up a few hundred feet, and then boundary layer convection takes them up into the clouds in the troposphere, which is the lower part of the atmosphere. And
Thank you so much, Sam. Welcome to today's Council on Foreign Relations term member meeting. I am Chloe Domrovsky, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Disaster Recovery Institute International and a CFR term member. I will be presiding over today's conversation on reflecting sunlight to cool the planet. I am delighted to be joined by Stuart Patrick. Stuart Patrick is a James H. Binger Senior Fellow in Global Governance and Director of the International Institutions and Global Governance Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His areas of expertise include multilateral cooperation on global issues, U.S. policy toward international institutions, including the United Nations, the challenges posed by fragile and post-conflict states, and the challenges to international environmental cooperation posed by climate change and biodiversity loss. Relevant for today's discussion. Patrick is the author of The Sovereignty Wars, Reconciling America with the World, as well as Weak Links, Fragile States, Global Threats, and International Security. He also writes the blog The Internationalist. So Stuart, thanks again for doing this. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
It's great to see you again, Chloe. And I want to thank you in particular for the tremendous help that you gave as a member of the advisory committee for this report, and particularly your insights about the connections between climate change and natural or not so natural disasters, I guess we should call them these days.
It's my pleasure, Stuart. It was really quite eye-opening to be a part of this report. I work on the disaster risk reduction side, and certainly this has potential consequences, positive and negative in that regard. So let's jump into it. But before we get directly to the topic of sunlight reflection, I'd love for you to give us a brief overview of the climate problem as well as existing climate strategies that are relevant to today's topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to get the thesis out of the way up front, it's pretty obvious that from the suffocating heat we see in India to these rampaging wildfires in New Mexico, that we are in the midst of the global climate emergency that we've all been sort of worrying about for decades now. And faced with this clear present danger, we need to look at all of the tools at our disposal. And in terms of where we are with respect to the climate, as you know, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change recently finished its 6th assessment report cycle, both on sort of the nature of climate science, how mitigation efforts are going, and the problems and obstacles to adaptation. And we are really facing dire straits. And as you recall, in 2015, at the Paris Climate Agreement, there was a promise or pledge by the assembled international community to basically keep the global increase in global average temperatures from pre-industrial times to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally to no more than 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we're poised to blow quite far past that. And we're on target probably for close to a 3-degree rise, although there's obviously a certain degree of uncertainty both above and below that. And we're seeing ramifications that are quite disastrous from more extreme climate events. But we're also seeing the beginnings of what's going to be probably a huge surge of climate migration around the world, huge amounts of dislocation. I think even more worrisome in some ways is this question as to whether or not we're approaching tipping points in the Earth system. There are a lot of different subcomponents of the Earth's climate and environmental systems that sort of in a sense comprise the biosphere, but some big possibilities are massive collapse of the Antarctic ice shelves, a slowing down and perhaps even cessation of the sort of ocean conveyor belt that keeps Europe warm, collapse of or rapid dieback of the Amazon rainforest, which by some calculations is already a net contributor to greenhouse gases as opposed to a net absorber or carbon sink. So we're in really bad straits, and that we're even having this conversation and even contemplating something quite as dramatic as what my report deals with, I think is reflective of that. In terms of the natural disaster side of things, as you know, the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Report, their annual report, recently said that humanity was entering into a quote-unquote spiral of self-destruction, and that the incidence of natural disasters, or not so natural disasters, since of course they're anthropogenic to a large degree, has quadrupled since the year 2000. And there's even the World Meteorological Association said we have a chance to actually hit 1.5 degrees Celsius over the next few years, just in the next few years. So we're in dire straits. And the kind of strategies, happy to talk about those, the kind of strategies that we do have are simply not enough.
Yeah, it can be hard to maintain any optimism when you're working with things for too long. Looking at North End, we're looking at another intense hurricane season here in the U.S. for a second straight year. You start to really worry all the time. Can you just elaborate a little bit further on sort of like what are the current at least categories of strategies that you're using to address this challenge before we get to this
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and why they're falling short. I mean, the way I think about it is, we've got a quiver and it's got 3 arrows in it right now, right? The portfolio quiver called marine cloud brightening, and this is basically to loft sea salt particles, just sea salt, right? Particles from ocean platforms or vessels, probably several hundred, maybe a few thousand around the world, and you basically just loft them up a few hundred feet, and then boundary layer convection takes them up into the clouds in the troposphere, which is the lower part of the atmosphere. And what's interesting about both of these is the weight doesn't fall on adaptation. So again, as I said, it's given how the importance of when you think about the impacts of climate change, how hot it gets is really, really important in terms of all of these other sort of ancillary effects of climate change. So if you can shave the peak, then you might be able to buy your time. There are basically two. This could be done in a number of different ways. One of them could be putting up space mirrors, which Elon Musk and others have talked about. Probably very expensive. You could try to make the surface of the Earth itself more reflective. You could do that with different crops, etc. Also highly labor intensive, and financially expensive. The two most straightforward ways are to diffuse aerosol particles into the stratosphere. So a little bit above where planes fly. You could do this with specially modified aircraft. You can also do it with, in a sense, artillery shells. You could do it with balloons. There's a number of ways you can do it. The second way is called marine cloud brightening, and this is basically to loft sea salt particles, just sea salt, right? Particles from ocean platforms or vessels, probably several hundred, maybe a few thousand around the world, and you basically just loft them up a few hundred feet, and then boundary layer convection takes them up into the clouds in the troposphere, which is the lower part of the atmosphere. And what's interesting about both of these is they both mimic processes that are already going on. The first one mimics what happens in volcanic eruptions. Some of you may, I'm not sure if you guys are so young you may not remember it, but Mount Pinatubo when it erupted in 1991. In the Philippines, for the next basically 15 months, you not only did you get sort of spectacularly beautiful sunsets, you actually had global average temperatures to be reduced by 1.1 degrees Fahrenheit over the next 15 months. So this would be sort of a safer version of that. The other is right now there's pollution that we put into the atmosphere, and that has lowered average temperatures by between half and 1.2 degrees Celsius annually. So already we are seeing some of the benefits of sunlight reflection, albeit at some cost to human health because there's pollutants in the atmosphere. So those are two ways you could do it. You could do it pretty inexpensively.
Okay, so space mirror, very expensive, but the two kinds of ways of dealing with it in the atmosphere you already covered. Have either of those been tried anywhere? Have they reached any level of maturity and from a technological standpoint?
They have not been truly tried. There's been a couple of localized experiments above the Great Barrier Reef with marine cloud brightening that had some promising results, but they were very modest. And there's an effort to try to test some of the spray nozzle technology by the Marine Cloud Brightening Project at the University of Washington to test it off of the U.S. West Coast either later this year or early next year. Most of the stratospheric aerosol injection, just kind of a creepy name for the diffusing stratosphere, chemicals in the stratosphere, there was supposed to be a sort of dispersal device that was going to be tested above Lapland. It's called the ScopeX experiment, done by some folks at Harvard University, and that was supposed to happen last year. But there were a lot of complaints. They didn't really. I don't think they reached out to. There probably was not enough consultation with the local population, and it was sort of compounded by the fact that it was going to be done in Lapland, and the Sami people have often felt oppressed by the Scandinavian relative governments in the Scandinavian governments, and so the fact that it's kind of united environmental opposition and also folks for the Sami people rights, and so it became a pretty big controversy, and they ended up canceling the experiment, which is too bad because the experiment itself would have had zero impact on either health or the environment. It was just testing whether or not one of these delivery systems could actually work.
And so, just as a point of clarification, like specifically with the Great Barrier Reef one, I know that was kind of thought as sort of like creating cloud cover to help save the reef itself. Is there a way in which this can be done on a localized level, or does it always have a worldwide impact?
The marine cloud brightening stuff could be done on a localized level. It could be, and I think that, but if you particularly have enough of these things going on, the effects could be good. So a lot of people think that marine cloud brightening is just going to be a local. I was initially first started researching this, I was told by authorities I would say no, if you do this in enough places, the actual effect in terms of pollution will be global. That being said, this ain't going to be true or anything in the stratosphere after quite a short amount of time. There are, however, questions about, we can get into this, about what the different impacts in different regions would be. One of the things to bear in mind is that this whole suite of activities does not return the planet to where it was before we started pumping out greenhouse gases, even if it reduces temperatures, because it does nothing to concentrations of greenhouse gases. They continue to accumulate, and that's an issue.
Right. So can we talk a little bit about that? Like, so if it's deployed, it helps us keep the temperature down. What then happens? I know that there would be an effect on the ocean, for example, and if we stop doing it, is there a problem? How's that?
Yeah, and there are a lot of criticisms too about this. Because it seems, at first glance, I thought to myself, this is the creepiest thing I've ever heard of, right? Because it sounds like, who's playing God in terms of manipulating the global climate system? It does nothing to deal with the greenhouse gas concentration. So one of the big problems with it, but this is not really a problem because it's not intended to solve that. This is intended to buy time, so you actually do stuff that solves it. But one of the problems is it does nothing about ocean acidification, right? And the oceans are now like 30%, 35% more acidic than they were 200 years ago, which is insane in terms of when you think of like the food webs and what this is doing, and the ability of some of these microorganisms and big organisms to actually form shells. There are a lot of uncertainties about this, and they need to be taken care seriously. So I'm not advocating any deployment. I'm advocating research into it. Beyond queasiness with sort of playing God with the thermostat, a lot of people say, well, maybe could it have uncertain risks and could it change precipitation patterns? What's the impact going to be on the ozone layer? What's the impact going to be on agricultural productivity? How about human health? Human health, that is not really an issue, at least not directly, because there's already a lot of sulfates in the air, and it's a lot more than would be there than we'd be adding. And also you could use calcites or other things that are more neutral. And of course, sea salt is not going to hurt anybody. There are, though, other questions of justice, right? And the procedural justice, who gets to make the call, right? Who actually has the hand on the thermostat? Distributional questions. It doesn't return things to the way they were. So will it interrupt the Indian Ocean monsoon pattern, for instance? That would be a huge deal. Will it have influence certain things in the Gobi Desert, but which could be good or bad, and then good or bad things in Japan? And then the intergenerational question, which is once you start doing this, you need to keep on doing it until you actually deal with accumulated stocks of carbon and also reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Because if you don't, you have what's called termination shock, which is basically, imagine the greenhouse gases keep building up, you've been artificially depressing the temperature, then suddenly you start, for whatever reason, either because you wanted to or you just couldn't keep on doing it. Then suddenly what happens is that solar radiation makes those greenhouse gases that have been accumulated, that heats up really quickly. So you don't get the gradual increase that has at least some human adaptation, maybe even biological adaptation you can deal with. This would just happen really quickly. So, but the biggest questions I would say are not even those. The biggest, I think, qualm about doing this is something called moral hazard. And anybody's taking economics course, is probably aware of moral hazard, which is our philosophy course, which is basically an incentive to do the wrong thing, right? And so wouldn't it give a get out of jail free card to us consumers or governments, corporations, particularly fossil fuel industries, to we'll just keep far polluting ways because we get out of jail free card. So some scientists or even some activists are even opposed to even doing research in this. And there was a big question, a big sort of petition that went around an open letter saying we should have a ban on even publicly funded research in this direction. I think that's a terrible idea because I think that more knowledge will help us make the decision as to whether or not this is a good thing or a terrible thing.
Right. It seems hard to even answer some of these questions without doing some of the research. You mentioned Lapland, like they weren't even allowed to try something outside, and that open letter does call for like no outdoor experiments whatsoever.
Can I make another point too? Because we're talking about risk here. I think that this needs to be assessed in a risk assessment, because it's too easy to say, wow, this could have some downsides as well as some potential upsides. Because my question is compared to the estimated, I think, or to freelance. And so you need both. Is this a good idea? Evolving science here. I want this to be integrated into the cutting edge innovation in science agenda. But that's why don't put it in the cutting edge instruments.
Please click on the raise hand icon on your Zoom window when you are called on. Please.
The roofs of.
Our next question is from Lindsay Iverson.
I think wasn't there a book about the Vietnam, kind of, bureaucracy does its thing, and they obviously have a climate mandate as well. NOAA similarly has an Earth's radiation budget program locked into a system where Cuba and Nicaragua, just to pick two, some of the greatest benefits. If you were
get kicked back behind the urgent burning problem of the
peers would have to increase hugely. You want to have everything be as transparent as possible. I think packaging it and thinking, okay, let's weigh this with respect to what's going on would be useful.
Well, on the one hand, it's encouraging that there was some bipartisan support for funding, but if this becomes more visible and tied to the climate conversation, does that sort of go away, or can that be built on?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It has been insulated so far. In some ways, it's been insulated because it hasn't been elevated to the level not that long ago. And my distinct, and there's also been interest at the international intergovernmental, device, et cetera, to launch things into launch some of this stuff into the atmosphere. Again, I just don't know what kind of scale these things could actually. In this case, there's certain devices, or in terms of the spraying the sea salt crystals, or the diffusing, maybe modifying airplanes, et cetera. It's not a lot of money. And so you don't, the upside in terms of the rate of, the return that you're going to get on your investment down the road seems to be, or at least the scale of the industry or the sector would seem to be relatively modest. And I think most of it would be public procurement and contracts from governments, because although there is supposedly a company out in Silicon Valley, I think it's called or a startup called Global Cooling, which has, I believe that these guys may have a notion of using some sort of catapult device, et cetera, to launch things into launch some of this stuff into the atmosphere. Again, I just don't know what kind of scale these things could actually go to, or would need to go to actually achieve the results that at least the folks who are promoting stratospheric aerosol injection and marine cloud brightening are suggesting. So there's going to be some money, but I don't think you're going to see a gold rush into this, even if people decide that this is a good idea to go with.
So to close us out, because we are out of time, I have one very brief question for you, which you can give us a 1 or 2 word answer to, which is, bottom line, the fact that this is where we are in the conversation. Does the prospect of sunlight reflection make you more or less optimistic about our fight against climate change?
I think it does make me more. It makes me more optimistic. I think that I don't buy the moral hazard argument. I think, first of all, I think the global economy has shifted. There's been so much investment into alternatives and others that I think that alternative energy sources, that I think that this decarbonization is underway. It's just a question of getting us over the hump. And on the moral hazard thing, I believe that that actually the very prospect that we might be doing this, and there's survey opinion research to back this up, actually underscores the gravity of the situation that we're in. It doesn't make people say, oh, definitely, let's just do this because this way we don't have to do any of the tough stuff. They say we better get on this because this is kind of scary. If we're in these dire straits, then we've got to do something about the problem itself. And the long-term solution, of course, is decarbonization, reducing emissions and taking the carbon out of the atmosphere. And that should be the bottom line. So I reaffirm throughout that this is not a solution to climate change.
Well, thank you so much for your work on this topic, Stuart, and for joining us for today. To our participants, thank you as well for joining today's virtual meeting. And
Mine does too, but I can't. I don't have time. Well, we might. Jesse wants to bring the twins out to see the house.